This is the Golden Gate. It's the East Gate. It's known as the Mercy Gate to Jerusalem. As you can tell, it's been sealed up for a long, long time.
A pilgrim stands at the eastern wall of Jerusalem. She reaches out and places her hand on the stone. Then she feels it. A faint vibration, a low hum, almost like a heartbeat beneath the ancient rock. She looks around. Nobody else seems to notice. But she knows something is happening behind this wall, because this is not just any wall. This is the Eastern Gate, sealed for nearly 500 years, untouched by man, locked by prophecy. And right now, in this generation, something inside it is waking up. The question is, why now? To understand what is happening right now, you need to understand what this gate is, and why the world has been watching it for centuries. Jerusalem is one of the most contested cities on earth. It has been conquered, destroyed, and rebuilt more times than almost any other place in history. But through all of it, one structure has remained in the same location, in the same position, facing the same direction. The Eastern Gate. It sits on the eastern wall of the old city. It faces directly toward the Mount of Olives, and it has not been opened in nearly 500 years. Now here is where it gets interesting. Most people who visit Jerusalem walk right past it. They are drawn to the Western Wall, or the Dome of the Rock. The Eastern Gate is easy to overlook, because it blends into the surrounding stonework. But if you stop and look closely, you will notice something that separates it from every other gate in the city. It is completely bricked up, no door, no handle, no opening of any kind, just stone, solid, ancient, immovable stone. And that raises a question most tourists never think to ask. Why would someone seal a gate and never reopen it? Gates are meant to be used. They are built for movement, for access, for entry. So why seal one permanently? The answer to that question takes us back to the year 1541. The Ottoman Empire was at the height of its power. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had already made his mark on the world as one of the greatest rulers of his time. He was rebuilding Jerusalem, reinforcing its walls, restoring its ancient structures. And then he made one decision that nobody has ever been able to fully explain. He ordered the Eastern Gate sealed. No official record explains why. No royal decree, no military strategy, no political document. The records are simply silent on the matter. But here is what we do know. At the time, Jerusalem was home to a widely held belief that the Jewish Messiah would one day enter the city from the east, through this very gate. This was not a fringe belief. It was deeply embedded in the religious consciousness of the city. Jews, Christians, and even some Muslims knew the prophecy. And Suleiman knew it too. So he sealed the gate. And then he did something even more calculated. He placed a cemetery directly in front of it. Now why would a cemetery matter? According to Jewish law, a priest, specifically someone from the lineage of Aaron, cannot come into contact with the dead without becoming ritually unclean. The Messiah was expected to come through a priestly line. By placing a graveyard directly in front of the gate, Suleiman was creating what he believed was an uncrossable barrier. Stone plus graves. A wall of rock reinforced by a field of death. It seemed like the perfect plan to stop a prophecy in its tracks. But here is the part that nobody talks about. In doing all of this, Suleiman may not have stopped the prophecy at all. He may have fulfilled it, because more than 1,000 years before Suleiman was even born, a prophet named Ezekiel wrote these words: "This gate shall remain shut, it shall not be opened, and no one shall enter by it." Suleiman sealed the gate in 1541. Ezekiel wrote about a sealed gate centuries before Christ. So who was really in control of that decision? And more importantly, why is the gate now showing signs that something underneath it is beginning to move? Before we talk about what is happening right now, we need to go back even further, because the story of this gate does not begin in 1541. It does not begin with Suleiman or the Ottomans or even the Romans. It begins with a vision. Around 600 years before the birth of Jesus, a priest and prophet named Ezekiel was living in exile in Babylon. The nation of Israel had been conquered. The temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed, and the people of God were scattered far from home. But in the middle of all that loss, Ezekiel began to receive a series of extraordinary visions. Visions of Jerusalem, visions of the temple, and visions of a gate. In one of the most striking moments of his writing, Ezekiel described watching the glory of God physically leave the temple, not gradually, not quietly, but in a visible, unmistakable departure. The presence of God, which had filled the Holy of Holies, lifted from the threshold, moved through the temple courts, passed through the eastern gate, and came to rest on the Mount of Olives. Think about what that means. The most sacred presence in the universe exited through the eastern gate, and in doing so, it left a mark on that threshold that no amount of stone or mortar could ever erase. But Ezekiel did not stop there. In a later vision, he saw the glory returning, coming from the east, moving back toward Jerusalem, entering the temple through the same gate it had left through. And in that vision, a voice declared something that has echoed across centuries. This gate shall remain shut, it shall not be opened. No one shall enter by it, because the Lord God of Israel has entered through it. Now read that slowly. The gate is to remain shut, not because it is broken, not because it is dangerous, not because no one wants to use it. It is to remain shut, because God himself passed through it, and nothing that has been touched by the presence of God is meant to be treated as ordinary. That is a completely different reason for sealing a gate than any empire or military commander would ever think of. And it gets even more layered, because Ezekiel also described a prince, a future figure who would one day approach this gate, who would enter through it to present offerings before God. And after he entered and went back out, the gate would be shut again. Scholars and theologians have debated for centuries who this prince is. But the pattern is clear. The gate is connected to a coming figure, a rightful king, someone whose arrival through this eastern threshold is tied directly to the purposes of God. Now here is where the story begins to intersect with the New Testament. Zechariah, another prophet, wrote these words centuries before they were fulfilled. Your king is coming to you, righteous and having salvation, humble and riding on a donkey. On a Sunday before Passover, in a moment that would change history forever, Jesus of Nazareth descended from the Mount of Olives, crossed the Kidron Valley, and entered Jerusalem. The crowds laid down their coats and palm branches. They shouted words of praise, and according to the geographic alignment of the city, the gate he entered through was the eastern gate, the same gate Ezekiel had written about, the same gate where God's glory had once passed through, the same gate that would later be sealed by Suleiman. And then Jesus left the city. He was crucified. He rose from the dead. He ascended back into heaven from the Mount of Olives, the same mountain that sits directly across from the eastern gate. And just before he ascended, his disciples were told something by two messengers who appeared beside them. This same Jesus, who has been taken from you into heaven, will come back in the same way you have seen him go, the same way he went, from the Mount of Olives, toward the east, toward the gate. And here is the detail that most people miss entirely. When Jesus ascended, the eastern gate was still open. It would not be sealed for another 1,500 years, which means the sealing of the gate happened after his departure, as if the city itself was being prepared, locked, set apart, waiting for one specific moment in the future when the gate would need to open again. And that moment, according to what is happening right now in Jerusalem, may be closer than anyone is ready to admit. Fun. A young archaeology student was doing what most students do at ancient sites. He was observing, documenting, and studying the structure of the Eastern Gate up close. His name was James Fleming, and what happened to him that day is one of the most remarkable and least talked about moments in modern archaeological history. It had been raining heavily in Jerusalem for several days. The ground near the eastern wall was saturated, soft, unstable in places where it had never shown weakness before. Fleming was standing close to the base of the sealed gate. When the ground beneath his feet gave way without warning, he fell, not far, but far enough. When he looked around from inside the small sinkhole that had opened beneath him, He saw something that stopped him completely. There was another gate. Buried beneath the current eastern gate was an older archway. Hidden under centuries of rubble and deliberately filled earth was a second structure, a lower gate, older in design, different in construction, and until that moment, completely unknown to the modern world. Fleming quickly documented what he could before authorities arrived and sealed the area. Photographs were taken, measurements were noted, and then access was shut down. Further excavation was prohibited. But what he saw in those few minutes raised a question that has never fully been answered. If there is a gate buried beneath the current gate, which one did Jesus actually enter through on Palm Sunday? Because the current sealed gate, the one Suleiman built in 1541, was constructed using stones and materials from earlier periods. It sits on top of older foundations, and Fleming's discovery suggests that those foundations go much deeper than anyone had previously realized. Many scholars now believe the buried gate is the original eastern entrance to Jerusalem, the one that existed during the time of the Second Temple, the one that would have been standing when Jesus rode into the city on a donkey, the one where crowds gathered and palm branches were laid on the ground. Think about what that means architecturally and prophetically. There are two gates, one buried, one sealed, one that already served its purpose during the first coming of Christ, and one that has been locked shut ever since. One gate for a king who came in humility, one gate waiting for a king who will return in power. And both of them are in the same location, one on top of the other, as if the ground itself is holding two chapters of the same story, one already written and one still waiting to be told. Now here is the part that makes this discovery even harder to dismiss. Fleming did not go looking for a hidden gate. He was not on a prophetic mission. He was a student doing field work. The ground simply opened up beneath him after a season of heavy rain, and in that unplanned, unscripted moment, a structure that had been hidden for centuries was briefly revealed to the modern world. Some people look at that and see a geological accident, a sinkhole caused by water and time, nothing more. But others look at the timing, the location, the significance of what was found, and they ask a different kind of question. What if it was not an accident? What if something beneath the ground was meant to be seen? Not yet fully uncovered, but glimpsed, just enough to remind the watching world that there is more beneath the surface than what is visible. Because here is what we know for certain. The buried gate exists. The sealed gate above it exists. The prophecy connecting both of them to a returning king exists. And right now, in 2024, the area surrounding both of them is showing signs of activity that no one is willing to officially explain. The cracks that appear in the stonework without seismic events to account for them. The dust that falls from between the stones on days when the air is completely still. The faint tremors felt by those who stand close enough to press their hands against the wall. Fleming fell into the earth and found a hidden gate. What will happen when the earth moves again? Let's talk about what is actually being reported near the Eastern Gate today. Not in ancient texts, not in historical records, but right now, in the present day, from people who live in Jerusalem, work near the Temple Mount, and visit the site regularly. The accounts are not coming from one person or one group. They are coming from pilgrims, local residents, tour guides who walk this route every week, and worshippers who gather near the Eastern Wall to pray. And they are describing the same things, independently, without coordinating their stories. The first thing people describe is the cracks. Not the kind of surface wear that comes from centuries of wind and temperature change. Those cracks exist everywhere on ancient stonework, and they look a certain way. Horizontal lines where mortar has aged. Small gaps where stones have settled over decades. These cracks are different. They appear suddenly, across faces of stone that had been completely solid for as long as anyone can remember. And they run in directions that do not follow the natural stress patterns of the wall. Structural engineers who study ancient masonry will tell you that cracks follow load paths. They form along lines of pressure and weakness. But several of the cracks reported near the Eastern Gate do not follow those rules. They appear in places where the stone should be at its most stable. That detail alone is enough to make people stop and ask questions. The second thing people describe is the dust. Jerusalem is a dry city. Dust is a constant presence. But dust falling from a sealed wall, from between the mortar joints, on a still day with no wind and no nearby construction activity, is something different. Multiple witnesses describe standing near the gate and watching fine dust drift downward from the stonework, slowly, almost deliberately, as if something deep inside the structure is shifting, settling into a new position, preparing for something. And then there are the sounds. This is the detail that people are most reluctant to share publicly because it is the hardest to explain without sounding extreme. But the accounts are consistent enough that they cannot simply be dismissed. People standing close to the gate, especially in the early morning hours when the area is quiet, describe hearing something, a low sound, deep, almost below the range of normal hearing, not a rumble in the way that construction or traffic rumbles, something different, something that seems to come from within the wall itself rather than from outside it. Some describe it as a groan. Others say it is more like a pressure building, like the sound you hear when you stand in a long tunnel and something large is moving toward you from far away. Now let's be honest about what the skeptics say. Jerusalem sits in a seismically active region. The Dead Sea Transform Fault runs directly through the area. The city experiences minor tremors regularly, most of which are never felt by residents. Stone structures expand in the heat of the day and contract at night. Ancient mortar is porous and loses material over time. Groundwater movement beneath the city can cause settling in the soil and in the walls above it. All of those explanations are real. All of them are scientifically valid. But here is what the skeptics cannot fully account for: the timing. Because the accounts of unusual activity near the Eastern Gate are not isolated to one season or 1 year. They have been increasing, and they are happening against a backdrop of other events that anyone paying attention to biblical prophecy would find impossible to ignore. Wars in the Middle East, global instability, natural disasters occurring with greater frequency. A generation that has grown up in the shadow of Israel's rebirth in 1948, which many theologians identify as the single most significant prophetic event of the modern era. Jesus said that when you see certain signs, recognize that it is near, right at the door. He was speaking to his disciples about the end of the age, and he used the image of a door, not a window, not a distant horizon. A door, something you are standing right in front of, something that is about to open. And in Jerusalem, right now, the door that the world has been watching for centuries is showing signs that nobody expected to see in their lifetime. What comes next may be the most important part of this entire story. Every other religious site in the world. It matters to everyone, not just to one group, not just to one tradition. The Eastern Gate sits at the intersection of 3 of the world's largest religions, and each of them has something specific to say about this gate, what it means, and what its opening would signal. Start with Judaism. For Jewish tradition, the Eastern Gate is directly connected to the coming of the Messiah. The prophets were clear. The Anointed One would come from the east. He would enter Jerusalem through the Eastern Gate, and his arrival would mark the beginning of a new era for the nation of Israel, one of redemption, restoration, and peace. This expectation is not a minor footnote in Jewish theology. It is central to the hope that has sustained the Jewish people through centuries of exile, persecution, and displacement. The gate is not just a building. It is a promise carved in stone. And that is precisely why, for centuries, Jewish worshippers have gathered near the Eastern Wall to pray, not just at the Western Wall, which gets most of the attention, but here, at the sealed Eastern entrance, because this is where they believe the answer to their prayers will one day arrive. Now move to Christianity. For Christians, the Eastern Gate holds 2 layers of significance. The first is historical. Jesus entered Jerusalem through this gate on Palm Sunday, fulfilling the prophecy written by Zechariah. That event was the beginning of the final week of his earthly life, the week that ended with his crucifixion, and the week that was reversed by his resurrection. The second layer is future. Christians believe that Jesus will return, that he will come from the east, that his feet will stand again on the Mount of Olives, and that he will enter Jerusalem once more through the eastern gate, this time not as a humble servant on a donkey, but as the King of all creation. The sealed gate, for Christians, is not a problem to solve. It is a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The very fact that it has remained shut for nearly 500 years is seen not as an obstacle, but as a confirmation. God said it would remain sealed, and it has, which means that when it opens, it will not be by human decision, it will be by divine command. Now consider Islam. The Eastern Gate does not appear by name in the Quran, but its significance in Islamic tradition is deeply rooted in eschatology, the study of the end times. The gate sits adjacent to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, one of the holiest sites in Islam. And in Islamic end times tradition, the area east of Jerusalem is connected to the Day of Judgment. There is also a significant practical dimension. The Islamic Waqf, the religious authority that administers the Temple Mount, has maintained control over the area surrounding the Eastern Gate for decades. That control has been fiercely protected, and the placement of the cemetery in front of the gate, which began under the Ottomans, has been maintained and expanded over time. Why does it matter enough to protect so deliberately? Because even within Islamic tradition there is an awareness that this gate is connected to something that has not yet happened, something that, when it does happen, will change everything. And here is what makes all of this even more significant. These three traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, agree on very little when it comes to theology and history. They have been in conflict over Jerusalem for centuries, but on one point they are remarkably aligned. This gate is not ordinary. Its opening will not be an ordinary event, and whoever or whatever passes through it when it finally opens will not be an ordinary figure. Three faiths, one gate. One moment that all of them are, in their own way, watching and waiting for. And right now, at this specific point in history, that gate is showing signs of movement for the first time in 500 years, which raises a question that none of the three traditions can afford to ignore. If this is the sign, are any of them actually ready for what comes next? Most people think of Jerusalem as a city, a place with streets and buildings and history. But if you look at it through the lens of biblical prophecy, Jerusalem is something else entirely. It is a map. Every hill, every valley, every gate has a specific role to play in what the prophets described as the unfolding of God's plan for the world. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the geographic alignment that runs from east to west through the heart of the city. Stand on the Mount of Olives and look west. Directly in front of you, across the Kidron Valley, is the eastern wall of Jerusalem. And set into that wall, facing you directly, is the Eastern Gate. Behind the gate, further into the city, is the Temple Mount. That line, Mount of Olives to Eastern Gate to Temple Mount, is not accidental. It is a prophetic corridor, and it has been traveled by the most significant figures in the biblical narrative. In Ezekiel's vision, the glory of God departed from the temple and moved east. It crossed the Temple Mount. It passed through the Eastern Gate. It crossed the Kidron Valley, and it came to rest on the Mount of Olives. The same path, in reverse, is the one Ezekiel saw the glory traveling when it returned, from east to west, from the mountain to the gate to the temple. Jesus walked this same path on Palm Sunday. He descended from the Mount of Olives. He crossed the Kidron Valley. He entered through the Eastern Gate. He went to the temple. And when he left the city for the last time before his crucifixion, he returned to the Mount of Olives. That is where he wept over Jerusalem. That is where he delivered his most detailed teaching on the end of the age. And that is where he ascended into heaven. The Mount of Olives is not just a geographical feature. It is the place where heaven and earth have met repeatedly in the biblical record. And it sits directly across from the Eastern Gate. Now look at what Zechariah wrote about the end times. On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem. The mountain will split in two, and a way will be opened. A way from the east toward Jerusalem, the same direction the glory of God traveled in Ezekiel's vision, the same direction Jesus arrived from on Palm Sunday, the same direction the angels said he would return from after his ascension. This is not a coincidence of geography. It is a deliberate design. And the eastern gate sits exactly at the center of it, the midpoint between the mountain and the temple, the threshold between the outside world and the holy city, the door that has been sealed and is waiting. There is also something worth noting about the Kidron Valley that runs between the Mount of Olives and the eastern wall. In Hebrew, the name Kidron is connected to the idea of darkness or mourning. It is the valley where the kings of Judah disposed of the idols they removed from the temple during times of reform. It is the valley associated with judgment and cleansing. And it is the valley that the returning king must cross to reach the gate. Every element of this geography carries weight. The mountain of ascension, the valley of judgment, the sealed gate of promise, the temple mount beyond. They are not separate locations connected by coincidence. They are chapters in a single story, physically built into the landscape of Jerusalem, waiting for the final chapter to be written. And if the prophetic pattern holds, the final chapter begins at the eastern gate, which is exactly why what is happening there right now deserves more attention than it is getting, because the geography has not changed. The prophecies have not changed, and the gate that sits at the center of all of it has been sealed for nearly 500 years. But the stones are cracking. The dust is falling, the ground beneath it is trembling, and the Mount of Olives, the place where it all begins, is sitting exactly where it has always been, directly across from the gate, waiting. The question is no longer whether this gate matters. The question is whether we are standing at the moment when it finally opens. Jesus was asked directly by his disciples what the signs of his return would look like, and he answered them in detail. He did not say the signs would be hidden or difficult to find. He said, when you see these things, look up, not look away, not wait for someone else to interpret it. Look up. So what did he say to look for? Wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom, earthquakes in various places, famines, the spread of deception, false teachers rising within the community of believers, a world growing increasingly unstable at every level. And then he said something specific about Jerusalem. He said Jerusalem would be at the center of events in the final days, that the city would be surrounded, that it would be a focal point of global attention and conflict, that the nations of the world would be drawn into its orbit in ways that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. Now look at the world today. The Middle East has been in a state of ongoing conflict for decades. Jerusalem specifically has been at the center of international disputes, peace negotiations, failed agreements, and renewed hostilities more times than any other city on earth. The nations of the world have debated its status at the United Nations more than any other single topic in the organization's history. That alone should get your attention. But Jesus also mentioned natural events, earthquakes in various places. And if you track seismic activity over the past several decades, the data shows a clear pattern of increase in both frequency and distribution. Earthquakes are occurring in regions that had no significant seismic history. The planet is moving in ways that are measurable, documented, and increasing. Then there is the fig tree. Jesus used the image of a fig tree to describe the generation that would see his return. When the tree begins to sprout leaves, summer is near. In the same way, when you see these things happening, know that it is near. Throughout the Old Testament, the fig tree is used as a symbol for the nation of Israel. And in 1948, after nearly 2,000 years of dispersion, the Jewish people returned to their ancient homeland. The nation of Israel was reborn in a single day, fulfilling what Isaiah had written centuries earlier. Many theologians identify that moment as the sprouting of the fig tree, the beginning of the final generation, the clock starting on the last chapter of history. And now, within that same generation, the Eastern Gate is showing signs of movement for the first time in 500 years. These are not random events happening in isolation. They are data points. And when you map them against what Jesus said to look for, they form a picture that is increasingly difficult to dismiss. But here is what makes this moment different from every other generation that has looked at the signs and drawn conclusions. Previous generations did not have a reborn Israel. They did not have Jerusalem under Israeli sovereignty, which only happened in 1967. They did not have the specific combination of events that is present right now in this generation. Every generation before this one was missing at least one piece of the prophetic picture. This generation is not missing any of them. The wars are there. The instability is there. The earthquakes are there. The reborn nation is there. The global focus on Jerusalem is there. And now the gate is moving. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Not in a way that makes international headlines or triggers emergency responses. Just quietly, subtly, with dust and cracks and vibrations that most people will never know about unless someone tells them. Which is exactly how Jesus said many of the signs would appear. Quietly. To those who are paying attention. To those who have not allowed the noise of the world to drown out the signal. He said no one knows the day or the hour, not even the angels, only the Father. But he also said that the generation that sees these things will not pass away until all of it is fulfilled. Look at the signs, look at the gate, look at the generation, and then ask yourself honestly, what generation are we living in right now? Everything covered so far has been about a physical structure. Stone and mortar, ancient prophecy, archaeological discovery, geopolitical tension, signs in the world. But now it is time to shift the lens, because the Eastern Gate is not just a gate in Jerusalem, it is a mirror. And what it reflects is not the city around it. It reflects something much closer. It reflects the human heart. Think about what makes the Eastern Gate what it is. It was built for a purpose. It was meant to be an opening. A threshold, a place where people could enter and exit. It was designed for movement, for access, for connection between what is outside and what is inside. And then it was sealed, not because it was broken, not because the city no longer needed it, but because of fear, because of an attempt to prevent something from happening that seemed dangerous or threatening to those in power. Suleiman sealed the gate because he was afraid of a prophecy. He was afraid of what it meant and what it might bring. So he took the most direct action available to him. He closed the opening and filled it with stone, and in doing so, he made the gate into something it was never meant to be, a wall. How many people have done the same thing with their own hearts? Built for connection, built for openness, built to receive and to give. But somewhere along the way, something happened. A betrayal, a loss. A disappointment so deep that closing off seemed like the only safe response. And slowly, brick by brick, the opening was filled. Not with malice, often with perfectly understandable reasons. But the result is the same. What was meant to be a gate becomes a wall. What was meant to allow movement becomes a barrier. And here is the part that makes this parallel so striking. The Eastern Gate was sealed for centuries. Grass grew over the cemetery in front of it. Travelers walked past it without even recognizing what it was. It became so ordinary in its sealed state that most people stopped seeing it as a gate at all. That is what happens when a heart stays closed long enough. It stops being recognized as something that was built for openness. It just becomes the landscape, normal, expected, unremarkable. But underneath the sealed surface, the original design is still there. Fleming found it in 1969. When the ground gave way, the older gate was revealed. The gate beneath the gate. The original opening, buried but intact, waiting beneath everything that had been piled on top of it. The same is true of a sealed heart. The original design is still there. The capacity for connection, for faith, for openness to something greater than yourself. It does not disappear just because it has been buried under years of disappointment or fear or deliberate distance. And the same one who is connected to the prophecy of the Eastern Gate is also the one who described himself as someone who stands at a door and knocks. Not someone who breaks the door down, not someone who forces the opening, someone who knocks and waits, because the door is meant to be opened from the inside. That image is not accidental. The door that Jesus described in Revelation chapter 3 is the same kind of threshold as the Eastern Gate, a boundary between outside and inside, between distance and presence, between what has been and what is possible. And the instruction is the same in both cases. The gate is meant to be opened, not sealed, not reinforced, not buried under centuries of accumulated stone. The world is watching the Eastern Gate for signs of movement, but the more important movement is the one happening in the hearts of the people watching it, because the gate in Jerusalem can only open once. When it does, what comes through it will be visible to every eye and undeniable to every heart. But the gate in the human soul can open right now, today, without waiting for stones to move or prophecy to fully unfold. The question the Eastern Gate forces us to ask is not just about Jerusalem. It is about the sealed places inside each of us, and whether, after all this time, we are finally ready to let something in. There is a detail about the Eastern Gate that almost nobody mentions, something that sits quietly in the historical record and does not get talked about in most discussions of this site. During World War I, in 1917, there was a plan. Muslim authorities in Jerusalem, aware of the prophecies surrounding the Eastern Gate and determined to prevent any possibility of their fulfillment, made a decision. They were going to destroy the gate, not seal it further, not reinforce it, destroy it entirely. Remove it from the landscape so that no prophecy connected to it could ever be fulfilled. The date was set, the preparations were made, and then something happened that nobody planned for. On the very day the demolition was scheduled to begin, British forces entered Jerusalem. The city changed hands. The authority that had ordered the destruction of the gate no longer had the power to carry it out. The gate survived, not because it was protected by armies or fortified by governments. It survived because on the exact day it was supposed to be destroyed, circumstances shifted in a way that nobody could have predicted or engineered. You can call that a coincidence. History is full of coincidences. Or you can look at the pattern. Suleiman tried to stop the prophecy by sealing the gate and placing a cemetery in front of it. He ended up fulfilling the prophecy instead. Muslim authorities in 1917 tried to eliminate the gate entirely. The city changed hands the day they were supposed to act. During the Six-Day War in 1967, Israeli soldiers wanted to force the gate open as a symbol of victory. A Jewish religious leader intervened and said the gate must remain sealed until the Messiah comes. It remained sealed. Every attempt to control this gate, whether to keep it shut or to force it open, has been met with an outcome that no human being planned for. That is not a pattern that belongs to politics or military strategy. That is a pattern that belongs to something else entirely. And it brings us to right now. Because the gate is not being forced open by any human authority. No government has ordered its unsealing. No religious group has successfully campaigned for its opening. No army has moved against it. And yet, it is moving, on its own, without human intervention, slowly, quietly, in ways that defy easy explanation and resist simple dismissal. The dust falls on still days. The cracks appear in solid stone. The tremors are felt by those who stand close enough to listen with their whole body instead of just their ears. And underneath all of it, buried beneath the current gate, the older gate that Fleming found in 1969, sits in the dark, intact, waiting. Two gates. One buried, one sealed. Both connected to the same prophecy. Both located on the same wall. Both pointing toward the same moment. The prophets describe that moment in terms that are almost impossible to process with ordinary thinking. A sound like rushing water. The earth splitting. Light coming from the east. A presence so overwhelming that the ground itself responds. Not a quiet arrival. Not a subtle entrance. something that the entire world will recognize at once, regardless of what they believed before it happened. But before that moment comes, there are always signs. The fig tree sprouting before the summer, the clouds building before the storm, the tremor in the ground before the earthquake. And right now, at the Eastern Gate, the signs are present. Not loudly, not in a way that dominates the news cycle or forces the conversation, just quietly, persistently, in the way that the most important things in history often begin. A crack in a wall, a little dust, a faint vibration beneath someone's feet, a pilgrim pressing her hand against the stone and feeling something move. Most people will walk past the Eastern Gate and see an old wall, a sealed arch, a cemetery, a historical footnote, but some will stop and press their hand against the stone and feel it. And what they feel in that moment will be a question that the whole world will have to answer eventually. Ready or not, the gate is moving, and whatever is on the other side of it has been waiting for a very long time.